but sometimes it's very valid. And quite often, like I said, if you've done those 3 steps at the beginning, you may have just come to a slightly different design solution which would have solved everyone's problems, and you'd be walking away with an approval. Because sometimes people just want an approval. They don't really care what they want, they just want to get approved. They'll do anything that the council says to get approved, but they just want to find out what that is. That's where those 3 steps come in. If you want to learn more about the planning process and how you can unlock value out of any property, click the link below to learn more. So I wanted to put together a video for those people that have been through the planning process. Maybe they've got refused, maybe they've tried again, they're knocking against a brick wall, they can't get hold of officers, they can't seem to get a decision, and they just want to get planning permission for anything. So this video is going to walk through all the kind of options that you have to do with that, and also how to avoid the common pitfalls that I experienced with my time as a planning officer. So often people would just apply and just miss out some quite relatively simple things that you can do that would avoid this whole headache, and avoiding headache of trying to get hold of people and not knowing your decision, and then avoiding the appeal process, which is lengthy, is confusing if you don't know your way around it. So this video is going to walk you through that and give you some tips and tricks. So first of all, before looking at all the options and strategies we have for getting permission for something that you've already been refused for, the first port of call is always to check these 3 things that so many people submit applications without doing, and it just means from the outset that they're going to get refused. There are 3 key things that any application is decided on. That is the planning history, the site and surroundings, and planning policy. Now that is applicable for planning applications. That last one, planning policy, you can combine with legislation if you like, if you're going to go down the permitted development right. So the first one is checking the planning history. A lot of people don't know the power of this or understand the power. Some don't even know that this exists. So checking the planning history is a really fundamental step. So what that involves is, if you own a house on a street, it's going to the records of your local council for that property and finding out what applications have been submitted there in the past, what was the outcome. Now, more often than not, and it can lead to people feeling quite confused and not sure, but sometimes there is just no planning history for that site, and that's fine. That's what the next 2 steps are for, to kind of help you identify the best ways of getting planning permission for something. But there's planning history for your site, and then there's also planning history for the wider area, which can be a lot more fruitful. So if we're talking about a house, if you want to do a rear extension, you think pushing the boundaries, maybe it's a bit big, or you want to do a roof extension. If there's no history for your site, have a look at streets either that is your street or also streets that are comparable. So if you have a whole row of terraces that every house is the same, but there's no history on your street, it's more likely that there's going to be history for other streets. I mean, you'd be very surprised if there wasn't anything on your street anyway. But looking at comparable situations to yours is really, really helpful in finding out what people have applied for, which is the first step, and then what have people been approved for and refused. Because approved, there's a lot of information in approved, but there's a lot of information in refusals as well, because it gives you that contrast to the two. History is really important, and within that there's a lot of analysis that you can do. Every application obviously has a decision. If it's been approved or refused, it will tell you why, and it will tell you it's been refused because it's, so if we're talking about refusals, if it's been refused because it doesn't meet policy X, that is a line of research for you to find out what that policy says. Likewise, for approvals, it will say the same thing. It is in accordance with that policy, and then that's your line of research to find out why it was approved on that basis. So that's a really fundamental first step, and it's really, really important. There is so much information in just the planning history alone. There is the actual site records, so what applications have been submitted, what was the decision, and then also why was that decision come to. And in there, that last point is where there's loads of information that will show you how the planning officer or committee came to that decision based on the analysis of these 3 elements, and it will just put everything in balance. And it can sometimes, you can almost boilerplate take the analysis from that site and bring it to your own, and then build your whole proposal around that. So I've spent a lot of time on planning history, but so many people don't do that, and it's such an important thing to do. Checking your planning history can reveal so much, and it can be an immediate red flag or a green flag about where to go next. The second one is site and surroundings. So if you're in a terrace property and there have been no evidence of extensions on your property already, and there are also none on your terrace, so there's no rear extensions and there's no roof extensions, that again is a red flag. Why is that? And that then goes back to checking the planning history. Why has no one submitted applications? Or if they have tried to submit, have they been refused, and why have they been refused? It could just be that everyone wants to build things that are too big and you're happier with going for something much smaller. That's fine. But checking your site and surroundings is key. Also, in an example where if you're wanting to build housing or new units or something like that, or even a roof extension, site and surroundings is important for understanding what uses surround you. So if a residential street is fine, there's elements with that. But if you have things out the back, so quite often there are examples of, say, old garages that have been converted into workshops. That's kind of a noisy use. So those kind of things you need to be aware of if you want to build new units, or if you're doing a roof extension or a terrace, say, what you're doing there is you're increasing the chance for overlooking on your neighbours. So you need to find out whether if you do want to design a terrace, what is that then going to cause in terms of, can you look into someone's bedroom or something like that? Again, the planning history will show you whether people have applied for terraces, and then you can go from there as to what to do next. Now, the planning policy is the last one. Planning policy is, every council has adopted planning policies. I'm sure you're aware of that. And unfortunately, they can be quite generic, but there are sometimes policies within local councils that are very specific. For instance, in a lot of councils, there are backland developments. So if people want to do outbuildings in their back gardens, which is quite a common type of development in that area, there'll be a policy with that. And sometimes there'll be design policies that talk specifically about extensions and considerations for the surrounding area in terms of design and impact on the amenity of neighbours and that kind of thing. But as I said, planning history is the most fruitful, site and surroundings is next, planning policy is the third, because sometimes there is something in planning policy that will raise a red flag or give you a green light as to where to go next. Linked to planning policy, and this can get a bit confusing as to how it sits, but there's planning policy, which is when an application is decided, it is decided in accordance with a policy, say design. Now, there are other things called guidance documents. They have different names, so I won't confuse you as to what they are, but there are guidance documents that normally relate to specific types of development in that area. Sometimes there'll be like a residential standards guidance or residential design guidance. Sometimes there's always conservation area guidance, sustainability. Essentially, it's the council trying to expand their policies a bit to say you're not in accordance with this guidance, so it gives them more of a hook to make decisions on. But it's also much more helpful for you to understand. So even though it is a lot of paperwork, a lot of bureaucracy, it does help you in certain circumstances. Sometimes it might not help you, but the point is, it is there. It's there for you to review. It's there for you to analyse, to find out whatever you want to do, whether or not you can do it. So the reason I spent so long on those first three things is because a lot of people's knee-jerk reaction is, once they get refused, is to appeal the decision and go down the inspectorate because they think the inspectorate knows better, or the applicant themselves knows better. This officer or this department, they don't know what they're doing, so I'm just going to refuse and I'm going to get my permission that way. That's a very risky way to do it, because more often than not, refusals, despite what people think, quite a lot of the time are the right decision. That's not always, and I'm sure I'll get a lot of comments about that, but you really need to make sure that if you're going to go for an appeal, that you really know why you think you're going to succeed. Because like I said, a lot of applications are refused based on people not doing those first three steps. And if they haven't done those first three steps and then they try to appeal, it's highly likely that you're going to get unstuck in the appeal, you're going to lose that. And then after that decision is made, not only are you 6-7 months down the development line, you're also back to where you started, and you're just wishing that you'd done those three steps that I've just laid out. So make sure you do those three steps. It's really important to do that. It's just, every application is based off of those three things. Once you get that down, then you can decide what to do. Because a lot of people go with what they want first, and if they just do these three things first, then a design will kind of pop out of that, and then you'll be able to go from there. But obviously, if you don't want to do that, you do have the option to appeal. Now, there are three types of appeal. It's highly unlikely that two of them are going to be used, but what they are, for argument's sake, is when you appeal, you have three options. One of them is written representations, which is you submit a statement to the inspectorate explaining why you think the council made the wrong decision. Then there's a hearing, which is you do a statement. It's a much more formal procedure. You go to probably the council chambers, there's an inspector, and then there's the applicant, you, and then there's the council. And the inspector will be asking for statements from both of you, and then he'll ask questions based on the merits of the scheme to find out what decision is to come to. Now, those are really reserved for the more complex schemes or the bigger schemes, so that's less likely to be used. Now, the last one is an incredibly complex, and you don't want to go down this route on your own at all. You don't even want to go down the hearing route on your own, to be honest, but inquiries is the next step, and that gets very legal. That's when you want to get barristers involved, and that's when you're analysing the minutiae of policy. So I won't spend too long on that. In fact, I'm done with it. But those are your three options. The timelines for an appeal, you have, after you get your decision, once you get refused, you have a few months to make the appeal, make sure it's in time, but the inspectorate is just as busy as the council, so don't just assume that once you submit your appeal that a decision is going to get spat out. It's going to take a long time, very long time, to come out. So just bear that in mind if you're thinking about going down the appeal route. So we've talked about appeals. The other thing you can do is obviously to redesign the scheme. That can be a tough pill to swallow, but sometimes it's very valid. And quite often, like I said, if you've done those 3 steps at the beginning, you may have just come to a slightly different design solution which would have solved everyone's problems, and you'd be walking away with an approval. Because sometimes people just want an approval. They don't really care what they want. They just want to get approved. They'll do anything that the council says to get approved, but they just want to find out what that is. That's where those 3 steps come in. And sometimes when it comes to renegotiation, even just the smallest changes to a scheme can make it so much better. Whether that's the use of a different material, whether that's reducing the height by a little bit, bringing it back a little bit, or turning a 3-bed house into a 2-bed house or something. Generally speaking, sometimes it's either fundamentally flawed, and that's where people don't do those first 3 steps, or it's just little changes more often than not that will help something get over the line. But if you've done those 3 steps, the other option you can do, so if you've done those 3 steps to the best of your abilities, but you've still got a refusal, sometimes, quite often in fact, the quality of your application is what matters. So you can do all this history search, but the quality comes down to things like, is all the information you provide accurate? The basic level of that. Is the address right? Are the drawings clear to read? That is one of the most important things you can do. The days of people hand drawing plans and sending drawings on the back of a fag packet to a planning officer are long, long gone. Clear drawings that are done via CAD, via an architect or a CAD technician, really important for the scheme to be fully understood, because don't forget who's involved in the planning process. There are the officers, but there's also neighbours and the general public, and they object. Generally they object more when they don't understand a scheme. It's also easier for you to make arguments against those objections if your drawings are very, very clear. You can just say, refer to drawing blah blah, it actually doesn't affect you because of this reason. And then you're in a really strong point. But if you have drawings that are unclear and you can't really make that argument because you don't really understand the drawings either, then that's where problems come about. So making a good application is really key. Good application forms, a clear statement telling the council what you're doing, very good drawings, and then the last one is things like additional reports that might be needed depending on the issues. So that's transport statement, design and access statement, trees, sustainability statement. Those are reserved for generally bigger schemes. So if you're just doing a house, you don't need to worry about those. But the quality of information that you provide is really, really one of the key pillars to getting planning permission. So make sure you spend a lot of time in getting that right. So those are all the things that you can do. But bear in mind, if you're doing all these steps because you've gone through the planning process, you can use these 3 steps when you're first reviewing a site before you get anywhere near the planning process. If you're looking at purchasing a site, those 3 steps that I outlined can really determine whether or not there is potential in a site. What's the planning history? What are the site and surroundings? And what's the local planning policy? Those 3 things are really, really important for understanding what you can do on a site, and that can tell you whether or not you can pursue the site and then you think you're going to get development, or you just turn away because it's going to be really complicated and messy. So those 3 steps are absolutely key. I know I've said it a lot, but they are fundamental and they will unlock any site.